The morning sun peeked through the curtains. As Nana prepared for what seemed like just another ordinary day at Sweet Dreams Bakery. She had worked there for 5 years, always arriving early to bake fresh bread and pastries. But today would be different, though she didn't know it yet. As she tied her apron, she heard a gentle knock at the bakery's door. It was unusual, the shop wouldn't open for another hour. Through the glass, she saw an elderly man holding an old, worn photograph. "I'm sorry, but we're not open yet," Nana called through the door. But something in the man's eyes made her pause. She opened the door slightly. "Please," he said softly, "I've come a long way. This bakery. It holds a very special memory for me." He held out the photograph, and Nana took it carefully. The image showed a young couple standing in front of a bakery, this very bakery, but from many years ago. "That's me and my wife Helen," the man said, his voice filled with warmth. 50 years ago today, we met right here. She was a baker, just like you." Nana invited him in, putting on a pot of coffee as he settled at one of the small tables. His name was George, and he began to tell his story. 50 years ago, he had been a delivery boy for the local newspaper. Every morning, he would pass by the bakery, drawn by the wonderful smells. One day, he finally gathered the courage to go inside. Helen was behind the counter, covered in flour but smiling brightly. "She gave me a freshly baked cinnamon roll," George remembered, smiling. "Said it was on the house because I was her first customer that day." We talked for hours after her shift ended. They fell in love over morning pastries and coffee. George would finish his paper route early just to spend time at the bakery. Helen taught him about different types of bread, and how to tell when they were perfectly baked by the sound they made when tapped. "We were married right here in the bakery," George continued, touching the photograph gently. "The owner insisted. Said he'd never seen two people more in love." Nana listened, fascinated, as George shared more stories. Helen had worked at the bakery until they started their own family. They had 3 children, and she always made special birthday cakes for each of them. "Helen passed away last year," George said quietly. "But before she did, she made me promise to come back here today, on our anniversary. She said love stories should be remembered where they began." Nana felt tears in her eyes. Looking at the photograph again, she noticed something familiar about the way the bakery's display was arranged. It was almost exactly like how she set it up every morning, without ever knowing why. It was just how the previous owner had taught her. The previous owner learned it from Helen, George explained, seeing her realization. She always said a bakery should feel like home. Suddenly, Nana had an idea. She went to the kitchen and began mixing ingredients: flour, cinnamon, sugar, and butter. George watched, his eyes widening as the familiar smell filled the air. "Cinnamon rolls," he whispered. Just like that first morning. While the rolls baked, Nana and George continued talking. He told her about Helen's special recipes, the secret ingredients she used, and how she believed that baking was a way of showing love. When the cinnamon rolls came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, George took one bite and tears filled his eyes. "They taste just like hers," he said softly. That day, Nana changed the bakery's special board. Usually, it listed the day's offerings, but today, it read, "Helen's Cinnamon Rolls, a love story since 1975. Throughout the day, as customers came and went, George sat at his table, sharing his and Helen's story with anyone who would listen. People were drawn to his warmth and the old photograph he proudly showed. Before leaving, George wrote down Helen's special recipes in Naina's notebook. "These should stay here," he said, "where our story began." Helen would have wanted that. From that day on, Helen's cinnamon rolls became the bakery's most popular that year. Naina hung the old photograph on the wall, adding a small plaque that told their story. The bakery became known not just for its delicious pastries, but as a place where love stories were remembered and celebrated. Every year after that, George returned on his anniversary. And every time, Naina had a fresh cinnamon roll waiting, his first customer of the day. Just like Helen had been for him all those years ago. Sometimes the sweetest memories are made in the simplest moments, Naina learned. And sometimes, all it takes is a cinnamon roll and an open heart to keep a love story alive.